Welcome to Learning cEDH, the podcast dedicated to teaching you everything you need to know about competitive Commander. I'm your host, Matthew, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Eric. And today, we're back. And we're bringing you usually one of, the highlights of the series for some people, the ones that a lot of people really look forward to, and that is the quarterly update. This is the last update for 2023, where we're looking at all of the decks that topped events with 64 or more entries in between October and the end of the year in December. Looking at the top 10, we're gonna highlight some honorable mentions, but we're gonna be going through like we always do, breaking down the number of top 16s these decks got versus the entries they had, and then boiling that down into the conversion rate. And of course, if you want to follow along, you can follow this at the link down below. It's going to point you to EDH Top 16, which is one of the best new resources that we've had and allows us to do this really awesome series.
Yeah, they're awesome. And so this is not a tier list. You know, a lot of people go, how do you do your tier list? I'm like, well, it's not a tier list. It's just based on performance for us. That's what we like to do. So that way it keeps it's consistent. Because one thing I notice is people like to move the goalpost for like parameters for decks and stuff. And like there might be special considerations, like if there's like the Mox Masters Invitational, which didn't have a full 64 players. That's a little bit different because that's a qualifier event where a lot of people had to had some of the best players into it. And it was right on the cusp. It's in the 50s, high 50s, maybe mid 50s, something like that. So just for those, if you haven't watched one of these episodes before, just understand where we're coming from. We're just strictly basing this off analytics. This isn't like a bias or anything like that.
Yeah, this isn't our tier list, like Eric was saying. We don't. The point here is not to turn our opinions into data. It's really to give kind of opinions on the data, and we'll talk about why certain decks we think maybe rose up or fell down. This is another list where I think 8 of the 10 decks have moved positions. So it is a pretty different list from the last top 10, and we're going to go over that last top 10 so you can compare it as we go along. Again, kind of sorry we had a bit of a break. We had a whole bunch of stuff come up. There was an episode that was supposed to come out, and if you watch my last video, you'll know why it didn't come out. Looking to run a great cEDH event? Having hosted over 100 successful tournaments, Eminence Gaming has your back with Command Tower. With its intuitive tournament manager dashboard, you can handle everything from deck list submission to player management in just a few clicks. Then, all players need to do is scan a generated QR code to have access to your full tournament bracket. Put your players first with seamless pairing software and real-time access to standings. Take the guesswork out of tournaments. Give Command Tower a try for your next event. Before we hop into it, we did have a patron submitted question. If you're a patron over on Patreon, you can submit podcast questions for us to talk about in episodes. And this one is from TRS Aphelion. I don't know if that's a real word. Hopefully I got the name right. The question we're going to talk about is, what does Stax need to become a viable tournament archetype? So, for some players who maybe aren't aware of like the tournament scene, you might see Stax a lot in your local scene, especially. I think a lot of people, they get, for whatever reason, there's just way more Stax at like smaller events that are just more local. I don't know. I don't get it, but there isn't really honestly at this point a single like dedicated Stax list that consistently performs. We saw like the closest thing be like kind of Talion in recent times, which is like, even Talion players will argue it's not a Stax deck, it's like a mid-range deck kind of. And then people will think of like Winota as an example, which was kind of more of a turbo deck or like a fast mid-range deck that ran a lot of Stax pieces. In my mind, I think what Stax needs to be successful is the ability to actually target something in the metagame that is really so prevalent that shutting it down makes your deck actually very strong. So, for example, the most powerful we've really seen Stax be in kind of recent history, and even this is kind of diving to like what I would consider like what the current golden age of cEDH that we're in, is like the Rule of Law versus Turbo Nas meta, where Turbo Nas was so critical as such a major part of the format that your deck being just full of Rule of Laws made it like actually have a big impact on what's happening. But I think current cEDH deck construction, like what succeeds is, I mean, we're going to look at today basically 8 mid-range decks that honestly either benefit from or can just brush off most stacks because the net that those decks kind of throw is so like broad. They just get to do everything that they want to do, and you slowing the game down doesn't really make sense because like what Stax is really good at targeting like turbo decks. It's really good at stopping those, but those decks are already punished by the decks that are good. They don't tend to do that great into like, like a triple mid-range pod. They can kind of get beat up. So I really think what Stax lacks currently is an identity because they shut down the decks that aren't even really the best. With like at least the Stax pieces that we tend to see.
Yeah. So for me, like when I look at stacks and like there are good stacks cards, right? Like there's tons of them actually. But I think stacks as a concept, it's so hard in this particular metagame. And we're talking about like stacks as like a deck, like an archetype.
Yeah.
I would have to think that a stacks commander has to break parity with its own stacks pieces. So when I look at that, it's like Winona, great example, right? But then it became a very unfair format for it because first off, the card quality is really low in the deck list, and it's not in the best colors. And people started packing removal, or they respected it more and remove it on site, as much as possible. Like, oh, there's a Winona in a pod, whether it's a Deadly Rock, Fatal Push, I don't know, any Path to Exile, those type of cards, and then we see that a lot. Like, there's like, read Winona. It's like fundamentally a broken Magic card. Even what's the green white creature that's very similar that has like no, it's not similar to Winona, but it draws lots of cards and
Elevir.
There we go. See, that tells you how much I like actually know. I was like, I know what the card does.
Yeah, that is one we have seen have a little bit of success recently. It's not going to be featured here, but it's shown up at like medium-sized events.
Right. And so like those cards are pretty good, like fundamentally. Like you read them like, man, these do a lot of things and stuff. But I just think it's so hard to consistently play a deck that is trying to 1v3. And you have to have there like I even think Stax is like one of those things that's kind of harder than Turbo, like in terms of the politics aspects, because nobody likes really playing against you. Like truly, by and large. Nobody likes to have their mana crypt shut off, right? It's kind of hard to be proactive in those decks because, like, for example, you want to run rule law effects, but if my A plus B is a 2-card combo, I can't use it. So when I look at that, it makes it fairly difficult for those decks to fundamentally play in a 4-player environment. Now, I think there are stacks cards that work very well in the strategies that we'll highlight here shortly, and that's a little bit different because they're like pretty powerful like cards in a particular situation.
Or they're like built-in asymmetrical effects. Like you don't have to try to break them; they're naturally breaking parity themselves.
Yeah, and I'm gonna be honest. I thought Stax's decline really started when they printed Ottawa and Beseju. That's when it started. And then they printed Orcish Bowmaster. And then so, like, and I know these decks still do very, like, I think Gold Sabertooth won't be reflected in this. I think top 16 with Blood Pod. That the good player, a little bit different. It's overall like got lots of good high quality cards in it. It can do lots of stuff and it can win through its own stacks pieces.
Yep.
So it's a little bit different than like, the traditional rule of law, lock everything down decks and Talion was kind of the bridge there, if you think about it, because it could win through its own rule of law effects. But I don't know. I just think it's a fundamentally flawed concept in a 4-player environment. That's just my opinion. I'm definitely could be wrong on it, but
it's definitely, I think from an outside observer, if you came into cEDH now and you weren't told exactly like the idea of like, oh, the meta is a rock, paper, scissors of turbo, mid-range, and stacks, that isn't a concept you would even come away with like looking at a tournament. I don't think you wouldn't look and see. You don't even really see a large enough you would, I think, archetypally be able to point out like, oh, this deck seems to really try to go under what other decks are doing, and you'd probably be able to like still spot like the turbo decks. Of course, if you're looking more at like top 16s, they don't tend to top 16 as much, so you're not going to see as many of them. It won't feel like, oh, this is these two archetypes fighting. It's going to be like the main decks are these sort of piles of either high card quality. Like I think that's more the things you'd come across. Like you have decks that are sort of like partnery high color piles versus decks that are more synergistic, commander focused kind of decks. Not as much, and you're not going to see any Stax decks at all. Like you don't, they just aren't really the tournament force that they are. They happen, it comes up, people will like spike a top 16, but it's really more like every other event gets one. It's not like, hey, 3 Stax decks, 4 turbo decks, then the rest mid range. It's a lot of what we would describe as a mid range, and maybe we as cEDH players have to do a better job of breaking down the differences in lists because those large macro archetypes aren't even really represented in the decks that we see currently.
Like it felt like it used to be like that, like maybe like a year and a half, like year and a half, 2 years ago. But it's very much different now. And part of that is there's more players playing cEDH. So more decks are getting worked on and discovered. Also, they're just printing 4 mana powerful cards. So,
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to argue with, if they're just going to keep printing cards like the One Ring, and even Beseech is played in like these decks that aren't inherently like a turbo card, but yet it's like, it could be a storm card. It could just be like a really powerful 4 mana tutor, and then as we've said this multiple times, wait till Modern Horizons 3 this summer. That is where we'll probably get a really good, spicy handful of playables.
Yeah, probably
Green
going to be
Esper
some
Sentinel,
shakeups.
let's go.
Let's do
Yeah,
it.
Green Esper Sentinel, let's go.
Also, Eric mentioned Beseech. If you're playing against the rule of law, don't bargain your Beseech the Mirror. It doesn't work. You won't be able to cast the spell. We're going to quickly kind of go over some of the honorable mentions we want to talk about that don't quite make the top 10, but that we wanted to highlight here. I'll kind of briefly mention Akiri Thrasios with a really small, so 4 top 16s, 5 entries for an 80% conversion rate. Really small sample size, but a really consistent deck that is in the colors and most of the composition of like Dawnwaker Thrasios, which is when we started this list, when we started doing this in March, or I guess probably early April, that was going to be a top 10 contender. The duration of this time we do this series, like that's a really established deck, and that's been falling off. That's not even been like mentioned since the second episode. I think that's just not a deck archetype anymore, really.
It's weird. I remember a really ruggedly handsome bearded gentleman wearing Oliver Peoples glasses was like, I just don't think this deck is why not just play it more turbo? No, I'm just joking. I'm just trolling. So, but no, that really happened.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of these Akiri Thras lists are like trying to trim the fat off of what was like the established Dawnwaker deck, which was like something we had both talked about as being like kind of clunky. The win cons are kind of weird. It didn't seem like it should work, and then now it just doesn't seem to work at all. The way it was being built.
And honestly, and that's not to say that deck couldn't get a retooling itself.
Yeah.
I think eventually people will come back to that list, especially because it is a Seedborn, like Dawnwaker is the Seedborn Muse list. It can play the One Ring, pretty powerful stuff. And if you do play that deck, please play Grand Abolisher because that card is good.
Yeah.
and
we definitely see like more win cons trying to like one of the top performing decks. One having Minsc and Boo, which I think this is one I covered, which I was very excited about seeing Minsc and Boo just in the deck.
So I played against Wyatt before. Actually played. We ID'd, but we ended up playing the match at Final Flavor. That's the one where I went off on turn 2. But regardless, like the list was he mulliganed super low, but it was still super scary because he had like a Mystic Remora, and it was like he was a breach away from winning the game because it just was able to present something super crazy. And Wyatt's a good player, super nice person. I really like this list a lot.
It's definitely looking at it more like a Jeskai breach list that adds like some of the strengths of green, like the green stuff that you get, instead of like the very green focused build. Like there's no mana dorks here. You are running cards like Ragavan, which we never saw on Dawnwaker really, and then like Bomberman, which is a win con you don't always see. Even like the breach stuff was often not used in those decks. It was like kind of more of a rarity. Running like Wheels, not something you saw as much, and then just adding in the couple of cards that you get access to that are good here, like Worldly Tutor goes well with your creature combo lines. The Neoforms, Finales, Eldritch Revolutions, of course, good in these kind of decks. They are doing the like toolboxy, like you want to do. You have access to like Spellseeker, Eternal Witness, those sort of like those cards that you would have expected in the old list, but you just have a lot of win cons, a lot of the fat trimmed. You're not doing the Kinnan Basalt Monolith stuff because doesn't really line up with your cards. You're not supercharging dorks anymore. You don't have any. But yeah, this is a cool list. This is a commander pairing I had tried, but and one I would like to try some more. This is a cool looking one.
Yeah, and just to highlight one more thing, this list is built very similar in the same vein as effectively like a Rogsai list. It's taken advantage of Mox Amber and Springleaf Drum, and it's got 4 talisman like effects into it. A list that was originally traditionally like kind of played like super mid-rangey list, and it's got like the Spellseeker Ephemerate package to go get like your Final Fortune and kind of do the thing and tutor all that stuff up. So it has that package as well. Again, super cool list, and probably one that is better than it's represented because it just doesn't have a lot of people playing it, but the people who do play it do fairly well with it.
One thing we kind of talked about a bit, not really done a full episode on, maybe it's something to talk about at some point, is like how Nas isn't that as important of a card in the format anymore. It's still a card you see, but it's not, there aren't as many, like, you don't really see dedicated Nas decks as much. And Varagoth, which is a honorable mention we're going to talk about here, coming in at 13, is the most dedicated Nas deck you could possibly build. We're not going to go too much into exactly how it works in the combo lines because there is it is one of the most one of the few decks in this format that really just plays on a different axis. It does its own thing. It ignores the concept of card quality entirely by running a deck that you can add Nas and draw your entire deck. Purely seeks to do the Nas things. And it does it well. And it's had, again, very small sample size, 4 top 16s, 9 players for a 44% conversion rate. But it kind of just showed up and kind of bodied one specific tournament that was
Salt City.
Yeah, Salt City with 3 players in the top 16. Really wild performance there. Definitely a cool list to check out if you're more interested in kind of the more extreme builds that you can pull off in this format.
Yeah, it's like, it reminds me of like Mono Black Cody.
We'll mention Corvold because we have to. But if you're aware of recent events, this Corvold really should have at least 2 of the top 16s it has on here kind of marked off, kind of thrown out.
Asterisks.
Big asterisk next to them. Still an awesome deck that has been getting better and has, good performances in a variety of builds, but especially like its established build that, people like Eric have worked on is looking to be pretty sick right now. But again, we kind of have to mention like, yeah, it's number 11 here. Normally we'd be super hyped about it, but kind of been soured a bit. I will mention Ob Nixilis as probably most likely on here to show up in the top 10 in the next episode. This is a deck that it's just, if you play against it, it generates so many cards. It gets a commander that can just kill. It's like Murder Bird, Jessica Ishai, but if that was also a Ristic study that was like taxing people's life totals, it does a lot in Rakdos, and it doesn't just do the traditional Rakdos thing. Like, it's not a turbo Nas deck. It can go very quickly, but it does it differently, and it's more of a synergistic build, but it really breaks the synergies that it has.
Obviously taking advantage of cards like Mayhem Devil, Orcish Bowmaster, and it gets to run cool cards. I believe is it Bolt Bin, the one that has like effectively, has to have like ferocity or whatever, creature power 4 or greater, but like it gets to run some really sweet stuff like that. As time has progressed, it was kind of hot, then it dipped off, and then it picked back up because people refined the deck list. So you have a lot less like just pew dedicated stuff to it that are just like really good cards because it plays very similar. It was kind of the Talion before the Talion, right? It plays a lot to just how a lot of the commander games go, with people picking themselves off their lands, whether it's a fetch, a City of Brass, Mana Confluence, those type of cards. And it just, people are paying that, like they pay that life. And so it just inherently plays into the situation, the way the deck goes. So it's pretty interesting. It's cool. I like it. I mean, I don't know, like, I guess my fear has always been like something like Drannith Magistrate, but then when you look at the deck, it has a ton of removal.
It runs a ton of removal and about as much protection as a Rakdos deck can run for the Ob.
It's one of those decks that I feel like it really, really, it's a pretty good Jewel Lotus deck. It's one of those. Who would have thought Jewel Lotus could match a card? And probably only the deck gets better moving forward because I'm sure there'll be some other random instance of a card that just happens to punish opponents, deal them a damage arbitrarily. It's a good card on its own, and then you go forward from there.
With the honorable mentions out of the way, we're going to really quickly kind of recap what the last quarterly update was, what that top 10 was, and then be able to kind of like have that fresh in your mind as we go through the list and see the changes that we've had. Yes. So our quarterly update for July, August, September, quarter 3 of last year, we had Yuriko at number 10, Dihada at number 9, Kenrith at number 8, Rogsai at number 7, Atraxa at 6, Sisay at 5, Najeela at 4, Tivit at 3, Kinnan at 2, and Tymna Kraum at 1. That featured a couple decks, I think, making it for the first time. Decks like Rogsai, Najeela, and Tivit dropping. Specifically, Najeela, we've seen kind of continually drop as like Bowmaster's One Ring and then just like other decks take over. And then I think that was Kinnan's first spot at number 2 that had dethroned kind of Tivit and Najeela that were looking like really solid. Like it looked like Tymna Kraum, Tivit, Najeela would kind of be the top 3 for a while. And then that hasn't really been the case. And we'll see how it looks in this list.
Number 10. Number 10 is Talion, the Kindly Lord, with 6 top 16s, 38 entries with a 15.79% conversion rate. And again, as a reminder, this is 64 or greater, ran by the EDH Top 16 software. Matt, what do you think about Talion?
Yeah, this was when we talked about it when it got revealed that this might be on the list at some point. It had kind of, I think it was an honorable mention last time because it had kind of started getting some results and hovered in that like 15th through 11th spot. I don't remember exactly where it ended up. And this was when we kind of expected could be depending on like how people built it and how it played. It seemed at first like it might just be the best deck at drawing, like getting a draw in a match in the format, but players are piloting it or building it now in a way that like, actually lets them win. It's one of the wildest draw engines you can have in the command zone, so it's not that surprising. Again, one of the like best Jeweled Lotus decks. If you get this thing out turn 1, the weakness of it is if you don't get this thing out turn 1, like I think its impact gets a little worse as it goes. It's kind of one of those decks that's like you can have absolutely absurd starts that only require mana. They don't really require anything else, any other specific cards. And then if you don't have those, you at least have a lot of control tools that let you kind of stay until you can develop Talion. Because Talion doesn't really necessarily fall off like, like a Ristic Study on turn 10 is definitely not necessarily at its best. Talion's still going to draw cards. The life starts to matter a lot more. Trying to do something like a Breach Loop through Talion on 2 gets a little bit harder. Even doing like the Oracle Tainted Pact. And then especially if there's Talion clones, it can get to the point where you're like, all right, cast my 2-mana spell, take 6. My opponents draw 3 cards. That can be really hard to break through.
And apologize real quick. I'm getting over being sick, so nose still occasionally runs. I know it's gross. Nobody cares. But, if you see me off the side, like having to like pat my nose, I'm just trying to save the the viewers and the listeners from anything. Like one thing I want to note about Talion is just how impactful it is when especially there's multiple Talions out, like Matt was alluding to with the clone effects, but just in general, Talion also just being a tool used in other decks. I would not be shocked to see if Nixilis somehow follows the same route a little bit because it is a little bit more dedicated. But for example, Corvold already runs Bowmaster and Mayhem Devil, so who knows?
Go.
That could be an interesting card to help break some of these like mirrors up or something like that for like these heavy mid-range mirrors. Watch Rogside. That'd be hilarious. Rogside just jamming Nixilis and Talion. I'm joking. Zane, don't beat me up. I'm just trolling hard.
I thought about it. I thought hard about the Talion. I never thought about the Obnix, but I thought hard about the Talion.
I just think Talion is a super powerful card. It's easy to cast. They keep printing cards like Ristic. Like the way Talion's worded is kind of ridiculous. Like the fact that like it could be mana, power, toughness, whatever. And then it's just like, oh, so literally a blind squirrel can put a Talion down and still get value off of it. It's just like, I think that cards like that kind of have that built-in like safety net is while I think Talion's a super cool card, I think it's a poorly designed card. And it should just be more focused, kind of like a Archon of Emeria in a way. Because like that's just like imagine a Stax piece like that. Like if the creature has like power 1, like whatever combination of the way the card's worded, you can't cast it. Like that would be pretty ridiculous.
It's got to be like number 1 new generator of miss triggers because of like how many different things like you're talking about it can be. Whereas like the number you pick can just there's a lot to think about. It's very much also like it seems fine in 60 card, but it is also clearly like here's the one of the commander cards of the set. Like here's a commander that people play because it just is absurd in multiplayer. But yeah, that's Talion at number 10. No ties at 10. We do have a tie at number 9. Number 8, both being 7 top 16s. It does look like they're now all sorted by conversion rate as the tiebreaker, so we don't have to qualify that anymore. At number 9, with 7 top 16s with 54 entries for a 12.96% conversion rate, we have Rograk and Silas. One of our favorite decks here on the channel. We always spend more time on this commander when we do one of these top 10s than almost any other one, and we're seeing it fall off kind of consistently. Like I mentioned, it was number 7 last time. It was top 5, I think, on the previous episode. I want to say like 5th, and here we're seeing one of the most, one of the true dedicated turbo decks of the top 10 drop off almost off the list.
Yeah, I do want to bring up, if you take a deep dive on the Rograk Silas, so if you look at your pilots, you have Sergio, really solid pilot. Connor, really great pilot. Two super strong pilots right there. And then Zane is, because Zane hasn't been as active in like tournament cEDH Magic because he's too busy bringing us amazing software like this and prepping us for other events for 2024. But he was right on the cusp of Lotus Series 2, which was the recent online event, along with William. And they were 17th and 18th respectively. It's right there, and we've talked about this. I've always said this. Like, I feel like I've always felt like Blue Farm's the just overall inherently best deck in terms of just the way it plays and performance. But I think Rogsai in like somebody like Zane's hand is the best deck. Like, I just think its ceiling to floor is so different because it just doesn't have that catch up mechanic that granted, it's got wheels and Ristic and all that good stuff, but it's one of those things where I just feel like you have to be like really in tuned with it. Like all combo decks or all decks that are like a Stormy based deck, you have to really know how to pick your points. And I think the average player picking up Rogsai is going to have a worse experience than the average player picking up Blue Farm.
Yeah, it can definitely be tough to pilot. This is, we kind of alluded to, like, adjusting for cheaters. There's one more top 16 under Rogsai's belt, because that 17th position would have been 16th. But again, we have another deck here that had more tops than maybe it should have because of this. That's just something we can't account for. We can't just remove the numbers because like it affects the whole event. It's not just like, oh, move everybody up one, because the pods would have played out different. So it's not something we can account for, unfortunately. It is just maybe a tougher world for a Rog pilot. If you find yourself, you look at the decks that are also on here. If you find like you're the one turbo guy in your pod of 3 responsible mid-range players, you got to really break through with some clutch plays or with like a really great mulligan strategy to get through. That is tough, and it's not the only turbo deck in the top 10 that dropped some slots. So we'll highlight that. So that could be like a trend that we just see in general. Yeah, I don't have much else to say about it. I don't like seeing Rogsai drop. I love the deck.
I will say, between the Discords and some of the Twitter chatter and whatnot, I've noticed a lot of people are starting to want to put like the multiple Final Fortune effects back into their mid-range decks. And Magic goes through these waves, right? Like it goes through this wave of like, whether it's meta cards, that type of stuff. And then we get to a certain point where people go, oh man, I'm really tired of playing against this grindy, format. Let me try to speed up the format. Jokingly, that's where like, some people don't believe in it, but that's where the theory of Mardu Summer came from. And most people don't know it. It really had nothing to do inherently with Mardu itself. It was more so a philosophy. Whether or not we see that trend take place again, I don't know. Obviously, we're kind of at a stagnant where we hadn't had new cards printed in a little bit now. So the format's kind of like in this very stable position. So unless we get like, some really pushed cards, in the next standard set, which is like, what is it, Manor of Markov or something like that? Or Markov Manor?
It'll be Murders of Karlov Manor.
Something,
next Ravnica set,
something that I'm only going to look for like the only good cEDH cards, and then not really worry about the rest of the set. We'll have to see. Again, I think MH3 is going to be MH3, I don't know how big the Fallout expansion is going to be. So
Yeah, that could be when we get something wild because there's definitely pushed cards. They're just not. They might not line up with what we do in the format.
yeah. Well, the junk mechanic itself is like we don't know what makes junk, but the
Yeah,
actual token is really good.
yeah, that'll
So
be cool
we'll
to
we'll
see.
see how that plays out.
So yeah, this is definitely one, and we talked about this kind of last time because Rockside had a drop where we're like, are we on the lookout for Rockside? Why did it drop? The next one, if this trend continues, it might not be on the list. So that will be like a big indicator that like Turbo's really in a tough spot. Because again, these like kind of two Turbo decks have been here since we started this list, and if one of those drops off completely, then that'll it kind of suck. That kind of kind of suck. I'm not gonna lie. So Rockside Pilots, get it together.
So number 8, it also had 7 top 16s with 21 entries, so a higher conversion rate at 33.33%. And it's another Grixis deck. It is Kraum and Tevesh. People talking about Big Boy Winner or whatever it's called.
Hmm.
This kind of falls into it because depending on the builds, it still has a very strong Grixis core, but its 2 commanders allow it to do that long game plan. And there's been some various builds too. I know Ian's list went like really, really changed up some stuff, played like a little bit more mid-rangey setup, added the Talion, added things like Ledger Shredder to help churn through cards, Flesh Duplicate, and that just gave it a little bit longer stability in the game, along with running like a counterbalance and Sensei's Divining Top package as well, and running Curse Totem. So just enough swaps to give it that nice stable position in the metagame, and it's just a powerful color combination. But and that deck also had a turbo build to it as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's Sharky who plays it, right?
Yeah.
And that list was sweet. Like I put that list together. It was super fun. And it felt more like Rogsai's bigger brother, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Like in terms of like very similar builds, ultimately kind of similar game plans, but has like cards like a Hullbreaker Horror, which also can be an infinite mana combo with your rocks, which you can bounce your Tevesh and do the thing, to basically draw your deck. But yeah, I think super strong deck. This deck's always been kind of on the cusp of top 10 or higher, and it always typically does well with a lower amount of pilots.
Mhm.
And it's super rewarding. It's fun. You still get to do the Grixis thing. What do you think?
It's really notable that like this deck got 2 tournament wins in this time that we're looking at. And the lists are pretty different. We talked about Ian's list, which is a little more mid-rangey, and then like that had like a counterbalance top package, and then there's also this other list that won that has like you're rocking cards like Reign of Filth, Yawgmoth's Will, Jessica's Will, that is able to do some pretty cool stuff. This is definitely a deck that, like you mentioned, I think it made the list like once. I think it was like 10th when we did it, and it's been like that honorable mention ish slot a lot without as many pilots. It's never had that many entries. And it is just like we've mentioned it as like one of the more forgiving things because it's also like a really flexible deck. Like one of the strengths that this deck can have versus like a Rogsai is sometimes you get a hand with Rogsai that is like the most mana you've ever seen, but it doesn't go anywhere. This deck doesn't really get that specific problem. You get the Grixis mana development, and then you get sometimes even the choice between 2 different very powerful early card draw engines that you can develop that both have their own like pros and cons. Like even that choice leads like a lot of kind of strategy and sort of the ability to like make or break your performance based on your ability to like navigate your pod. So I think this is definitely a deck that has a really high ceiling. It can be if you're putting Hullbreaker Horror in your Nas deck, it can be really clunky if you choose to do it that way. Like again, the other deck that won chose not to. Is not running any 7 drops in their Nas list, but one of the decks did. So like there's a lot you can do here, but this deck really does it well in a different way than Rogsai, but in at least for this top 10 an equally powerful way, having a much higher conversion rate actually, and the same number of top 16s, but less than half the amount of entries. I think this is a deck to look out for that could like stay here. I don't want Rogsai to fall off, but the way it's trending, that could this deck I could see moving up and maybe making it closer to like that top 5 range. All right, at number 7 with an asterisk next to its next to its name, we have with 8 top 16s, 42 entries for a 19.05% conversion rate. We have Atraxa Grand Unifier, which has been a mainstay of this list kind of since people really started jamming it in tournaments, showing that TNT colors are good, even if TNT is not. Kind of a high color mid-rangey pile that, like we mentioned last time, one of the strengths of it is like you have a payoff in the zone. You don't have a way to get to your cards as much as you have like a way to just like, oh, I have 7 mana, I can probably win the game, mini ad nauseum at home. And then also a creature that is absurd with clones, can be built in a more synergistic way to take advantage of getting it out early and just blinking it over and over and going crazy. But can also be built in like a slower, stable, more way to just generate advantage, get to a very safe position. You can do food chain, you can choose not to. Just like another really flexible, powerful mid-range option in the cEDH with using green.
The way I look at it, if Atraxa is good enough for Vintage and good enough for Legacy, I think
good enough for every format it's in.
It's probably pretty decent here. I like doing the Atraxa thing because I've played this deck quite a bit, and I really like. And it was just like, if I'm doing the Atraxa thing, it's so much fun.
Yeah.
If I'm not, and I'm just kind of like 4-color soup, cast my opposition agent, do this, I'm just kind of like, I don't want to play this. It's like, it's not like I don't like how the inherent deck plays, but it is a testament to this notion where people are like, green sucks. And while green hasn't got a lot of like crazy staples lately, when you commit to what green is good at, like tons of dorks, Gaia's Cradle, some list honor off Sylvan, Survival of the Fittest.
Yeah.
Those type of things, if you commit to that, Survival of the Fittest is that's a pretty broken Magic card.
Yep.
Like as a whole, we just moved away from it because a lot of decks started over time, went to the turbo route and they started cutting creatures, right? So then your survival isn't as good anymore. But decks that commit to that plan that have those cards, not bad. Because also oddly enough, like this is like they got Delighted Halfling. You get cards like Invasion of Ikoria. Some lists play it, some lists don't. It's one of those things of like, when you commit to what green does well, green tends to do pretty decent. But this notion of this green's just so porous, like people don't want to believe this. I think red's actually the worst color as a whole. It's super top heavy here.
Yeah.
But if you take Breach and Dockside out of the equation, red kind of sucks if you think about it.
Definitely very top heavy, whereas green is more of like the kind of just like, they got the workhorse cards that are just like, we're going to get you through it. We'll get you a little bit of mana, not too fast. We're going to get you some mana. We'll get you some cards. We'll get you some selection. But you don't have that like, oh, you resolve this 2-mana green spell, we're so screwed. They just don't really have that like crazy, absurd top end cards. But they are, which this isn't like in a lot of the other green decks here, they're not really looking for that necessarily because they're building for the floor being really high.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to put it too. Yeah, it's not trying to go in a like green is better than advertised like rant, but as you're gonna see as we go through the list, and we'll see like towards the top, a green deck that does green things tends to be pretty good. So I don't know. We'll see. Number 6, Kenrith the Return King, with 8 top 16s, 39 entries, 20.51% conversion rate. We've talked about Kenrith. Kenrith has returned to form. It stayed, it kind of like appeared out of nowhere for a little bit. And then it like started just doing well. Even taking down an event. It took down the end of the year Mox Diamond tournament by Tim Knowles. So I'm going to just kind of hop into his deck list and just kind of see what's going on. We've talked about how flexible Kenrith is, and we're going to highlight some of the things I just said about Atraxa. So cards that Kenrith play are Survival of the Fittest, Carpet of Flowers, lots of mana dorks, Gaia's Cradle. So it also plays a truck ton of green tutors. People forget that green tutors are probably arguably the second best tutor source because there's so many of them. They're very dense. Also, being able to play Kenrith, you get the A+B and Thassa's Oracle combo. It has Dockside combos. Matt, I don't know if you have the list pulled up, but I mean, its creature package is super, super spicy. And not in a bit spicy, I think so, word that's used for like,
Not in the like, oh,
Interesting.
you ran some bad cards. Spicy.
Spicy versus like, man, this is like a very well thought out list, and it's got all sorts of cool stuff. It even runs Agatha of the Vile Cauldron
Yeah.
along with Agatha Soul Cauldron. So
Lines both of those lining up pretty well with actually like a deck that wants to use Kenrith. Yeah, this is like kind of by, like far and away the most flexible commander that we feature. It's ever on this top 10. You can do whatever you want with Kenrith. You'll find lists that try to slant more turbo and just use him as an outlet. You'll find decks that like actually want him in play and are running cards like Jeweled Lotus and even are crazy enough to run like Fierce and SWAT with their 5 mana commander that they're not racing out sometimes. Yeah, it's really the like kind of I can do anything deck. And there was one that kind of hovered around that like honorable mention ish category like tier. And then yeah, like I think there was like a big retooling of the deck. People were like trying to get it more focused or get like a better idea of what they wanted out of it and the packages that they wanted. And we've seen like lots of different variants of it of being like the true 5 color good stuff deck of the format, and now it's just like established where it shows up, and I would be surprised if it didn't show up in the next update or the one after that.
yeah, I mean, like this list specifically is super cool. Like you've got Teferi Time Reveler stuff. Like I said, you've got Breach. You've got the Heuristic Mystic kind of package. You've got some Smothering Tithe action, Survival of the Fittest. I mean, it's awesome. Like it's a cool list. It's running Talion. It's running the new Dauntless Dismantler. It's got Luris. It's got Lotho, Kinnan. Like it's got Mayhem Devil combos, so you can like basically like kill people. Also, let's talk about Agatha of the Vile Cauldron. Pretty interesting card. If you don't know what it does, it's red and a green for a legendary human warlock 1/1 creature. Activated abilities of creatures you control cost X less to activate, where X is Agatha of the Vile Cauldron's power. This effect can't reduce the mana and the mana cost less than 1. Red, green, 4. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample and haste until end of turn. So it's a win condition within itself, like if you have infinite mana.
It's also like a really good. It's especially good with Kenrith because you can put +1/+1 counters on a creature, so you can buff Agatha, get it to where like you can get basically to the point where you can just like make Kenrith just like pay a blue, draw a card, pay a black, reanimate one of your things. And just on its own, just being able to like make your dockside reanimation loop or whatever like a mana cheaper is helpful here. And then it can also make it like go way, way, way positive, like super easily to where you don't even need to be able to go infinite. It can just like do one of your things so many times that you just kind of like break open the stuff that you're doing.
Well, I talked about survival, but survival plus Agatha Soul Cauldron, that's pretty good, right? You can just pitch your Ranger Captain of Eos to the graveyard to go get something better in your game state situation, give something a counter, activate it because it has the Ranger ability. So, yeah, really, really sweet list. Honestly, something I'd probably like to like sleeve up and battle with a little bit more when I'm, not feeling the storm route.
A synergy that might not be that apparent because people don't read this part of the card is Agatha Soul Cauldron with Emil. Is one, it's just good. You can just throw Emil in the graveyard and do Emil stuff. But also Emil has another ability that you just pay a mana when something enters, you put a counter on it. Then you're like, all of your creatures are Ranger Captains.
Emil, those kind of cards, pretty broken here because you can just Bowmaster somebody down too.
Yep. There's a lot. There's like so many different. Many different ways layered. To win. Coming up on our top 5 with 9 top 16s, 57 entries for a 15.79% conversion rate. Yes, all the way down here at number 5. That is a Najeela, the Blade Blossom. This is a deck. When we started this, it was like firmly 2. I think going into right before Lord of the Rings, it looked like it might even overtake Blue Farm as number 1. Kind of fighting with Tivit at some point in the middle of the year. And then post Lord of the Rings, we had a drop to it finally at, was it 3? Now down at 5.
Pretty, there's some obviously pretty good names. But what I want to highlight about Najeela is obviously we've talked about this before about the, whether it's Bowmaster, whether it's the One Ring. I just think the metagame at large has shifted where there are lots of creatures in play. So it really takes out the ability to win with the Derevi lines and Grim Hireling stuff. Now it can still do it, right? Like it can still do that stuff. It's all dependent on the gameplay. But as people just throwing like a random 1/4 out there to block because it has like the Mox Monkey ability,
2 mana 1/4 that is a one-sided Stax piece.
Yeah, so just cards like that just become like not favorable for the deck, and the deck runs removal, but it's I don't know. It's just like I think the tools are there for Najeela to make another push. You just have to pick a lane. And I feel like Najeela's kind of done this thing of like, I want to do this. I want to be super mid rangey. I want to be super turbo. I kind of want to play in the middle. I just think you got to pick a lane that's giving you the best results. A lot of the top pilots on Najeela have been playing other stuff. So you're not seeing Memo, I know Memo's been like working on the deck, trying to find like some new tools for it. I know what that's like, especially too, you have like a fairly established list, whether it's, a top deck or not, and then you're just trying to like find that small tweak to it that is it worth it? Is it really making that impactful of a difference? Is this like a card I'm going to tutor for? I mean, like is it Kutzel? Is that how you say the name of the green? Yeah. So it got that. I think that card's pretty solid, right?
Yeah, having a warrior that is a grand abolisher, pretty nice.
Yeah, pretty nice. But the list that did well, let's take a look at them real quick. Yeah, when I'm looking at one of these lists, 17 creatures, all the usual suspects. It's got Samut, Grim Hireling, it's got Derevi, it's got the Brain Freeze, the Breach, the One Ring. Yeah. And then, your normal kind of like counter spells, Grixis stuff. It's a weird deck because it's like running a bunch of green, but it's trying to be a Grixis deck. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like where it's, I mean, people will call it like 5-color Rog's Eye, and that's because when you're trying to do that thing, you're very much like Najeela is just like a cheap commander I can get into play if I'm not on that game plan. It turns on my Fierce and my SWAT, and I can jam out my 5-color Breach or Ad Nauseam kind of stuff. Like if you're doing that part of the plan, but then you also kind of need a lot of the green stuff to do I also want to be able to just pivot and do Najeela wins with either Derevi or Druid's Repository or Grim Hireling. A lot of those are usually like using like your creature tutors to get those into play or put them on top of your deck, whatever. And so, yeah, you do kind of have a split. And then you saw like one of those decks that won was doing this and also started running like Chatterfang again. Really leaning into like that is purely, if you're not doing Najeela stuff, that card, I mean, it has text, but it's not as good. It's not very efficient to play a Chatterfang, spin 3 on it, blow it up to give something like -1/-1 if you're not doing Najeela stuff. If you are, though, it can be like, pretty cracked. So if you want to go more synergistic and do like what, the Pongo stuff that we were doing, a year and a half ago, whatever, that's an option you have, but it's hard to do both.
Yeah. I'm just curious, like, remember when like Najeela was like, what was it, like almost 4 time walk effects in it? It was running the 3 red ones and the
Chance
red
for
white
Glory.
one. I wonder, because whether the fact that Najeela has dropped or not, it still put how many people in top 16? Was it 9?
9, yeah.
9 with 2 wins. So
Mhm.
there's not a lot of decks in the last quarter that got 2 wins. So it still has the capabilities to do it. It's whether or not the pilots who want to put the effort into playing it, because sometimes it's just easier to go, yeah, I'm going through all this effort, trying to figure out my mana base, all this other stuff. I can just play Blue Farm, like.
Yeah, I think it's
So-
really important to highlight that the top 5 is the numbers are like the top 16s and the number of entries are completely tied together. Like Najeela, which had previously been close to number 1 in entries, is now at 5th in entries. It's like almost 100 less. Like it's like 80 less entries than the number 1. So that's like a big factor too. Its conversion rate is lower than like the top 2 decks and some of the ones below it. But if you got Najeela 80 more entries, it probably going to get pretty close to, number 3 or something on this list. So it is also like people are feeling less drawn to the deck. Yeah, do you want to do our number 4, which has been like gone from the most talked about commander ever, it felt like, to just dead silence?
I mean, it's all right, And that is Tivit, Seller of Secrets. 10 top 16s, 67 entries at a 14.93% conversion rate. So a lower conversion rate than Najeela with like 1 more top 16. So they're pretty. Yeah, so Tivit did pick up a win for Treasure Series 8s by Chaos Tournaments. Came in first place with 4 wins, 1 loss, 2 draws. So let's take a look at that list. So I'm just trying to see if they're doing anything different than we've seen before. I think it's running some pretty, it's running like Get Lost, which is a newer card. It's a removal spell. Containment Priest, again, probably to fight off against like the green decks or any kind of reanimation effects. It's got the usual suspects in it. Like if you look at the list, the card quality is pretty high. They just made some concessions to having a little bit more card advantage engines like Archivist of Ogma, and then also just running a little bit more like Stax, like Containment Priest and Dauntless Dismantler. I feel like Tivit, when it started off, it was like, I think people just got really tired of Blue Farm, to be honest, and they wanted to be different. And the time sieve thing is really attractive. Like it's super fun if you've ever time sieved combo with the Tivit before. And then obviously an early Tivit, backed by counter spells is just so much card advantage. But we've seen Tivit take a dive, and that doesn't mean the deck inherently is bad because, clearly people are doing well with it. It did pick up a win, but I think it's settled now. It's settling into the niche of where people like it.
Yeah, it's like a Staxier Esper equivalent of Blue Farm that doesn't need to run a bunch of creatures to enable any of its strategies, but it just does because a lot of them are good or are like asymmetrical hate pieces. Kind of the Esper deck of choice, where it seemed at one point when we were doing these that Esper was like, oh, Esper's the new Grixis. Maybe not. This deck is still performing better than the actual Grixis decks on the list. Although it is like, I think it has a conversion rate closer to Rogsai than the other. This is like the second lowest conversion rate, I think, on the list. So it being that like super stable, consistent deck is maybe not as much the case, or maybe it is that the builds, like the ceiling has kind of lowered to the point where they're just like kind of struggling to get that slightly higher conversion to top 16. Number 3, Sisay, Weatherlight Captain with 15 top 16. So a big jump. All these other ones have been, one more or tied with the next one. This is 5 more than the next highest list. 85 entries, 17.65% conversion rate. So still kind of a middle of the pack conversion rate, but way higher entries. This deck has kind of popped off in terms of popularity. I think because like it's another one that was like we mentioned with like kind of a Kenrith, it was like a honorable mention ish deck, and then it was like number 8, 9, 7, and then top 5, and then boom, now we're here in top 3.
Matt, what do you want to say about Sisay? I know you're more knowledgeable about this on me on this deck list.
They keep making legendary creatures. They don't even have to be creatures. They keep making legendary cards. This is a deck I think people have just started building a little bit better. They've tried to really clean up the list. It's still being experimented with. Like we saw one, I think one of the winning lists that was running like Rocco in the 99, which is not a card that has any, it's a legendary creature. It doesn't have any synergy with, you don't want to tutor it up with Sisay. Crazy impactful creatures you want to tutor into play, that having your creature tutor be on a very hard to counter creature spell, pretty nice. And you again can have like, sometimes you'll just get a one, like has the strength of Rocco in the 99. Sometimes you just get a Ragavan because you're playing it on one, or get a Esper Sentinel. And then sometimes you're casting a Kinnan and immediately wins you the game. This deck just has so much ability to pivot. It's another deck that kind of plays very differently than most other like you look at the distribution of cards here, where there's like 8 to 10 planeswalkers, maybe a single sorcery, and in the entire list. Like it's very clearly built very differently from a lot of the other high color decks in the format, but it still interacts in kind of the same way, and it's harder to interact with. Of course, it gets very weak to opposition agent. Most decks are. This deck kind of doesn't do anything through op agent if you haven't already got to develop, or you have some kind of advantage in play. But even then, like if you get into a game where it's stalled out because of something like that and other Staxy pieces in play, this deck just gets to curve out with cracked cards. Just like, okay, well, I'll cast the Faber Eller this turn. I'll cast like 8 mana worth of stuff next turn, and just play my cards one at a time until I eventually break through, because if the game lasts long enough, it's gonna break through. And the moment something gets removed, this deck can just win an instant speed.
Yeah, I want to highlight the list. So it took down, it had how many wins? It had 2 wins this last quarter. I'm going to highlight Unrivaled.
I loved Unrivaled's deck. So I loved this version of it.
Pretty big fan of Unrivaled. I follow their playing career. Super great person to talk to. And they have a pretty good range of decks too. So things I kind of want to highlight. We'll start with the creatures. Olivia, Mobilized for War. That's a sweet new include, legendary creature. And then it basically is 3 mana, 3/3 flyer. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may discard a card. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. It gains haste until the end of turn and becomes a vampire in addition to its types. just really cool toolbox cards that allows to give haste to pump up your creatures. Obviously, when if it fits out first and you put your Sisay into play, it buffs your Sisay, which is kind of cool. Colossal Sky Turtle, another cool new include that's just a modality card. Man, yeah, it's got a lot. But the card that I thought was really interesting, we talked about this, was Teferi, Mage of Zafar. Is that how you say it? Zafar?
Zalfir? Because there's an L in there. Zalfir? I
Yeah.
don't know.
And this is the Flash Teferi. So this is the triple blue 2/3/4 flash. Creatures you own that aren't on the battlefield have flash. Each opponent can cast spells basically only at sorcery speed. Just another tool in the deck. And
we saw the win come from this card.
Yes.
Somebody, I think they cast like a removal spell or some kind of like piece of interaction kind of against the Soval. Something that the Sisay didn't want to play. And then just boom, immediately to Fairy and just win.
Again, a deck that got a pretty big upgrade this year, not only from popularity of more pilots on it, but just kind of cards overall. It got Agatha Soul Cauldron, the One Ring, Mount Doom, which really kind of helps the deck out and be able to win with a land. But this one is actually opting to play an Underworld Breach package.
Yes, that's like the one of the bigger. You tend to see different selections of the legendary creatures across the different Sisay lists. But the one that really makes it stand out is that it's not just running pure Sisay related win cons. It is doing the full breach package.
Yeah, that's what I just wanted to highlight about this particular list. Was very conscious on how they built their mana base, like most good pilots and most good deck builders. But
I really love these kind of decks. Just like it's just a brain bender whenever when things go your way, it just stomps over the table, of course.
Right.
But when they don't, you probably have a way to still get there. It's just like on you to navigate through it and figure out combination of ways to use your searches and setting yourself up to really do things. Continue to move up. We can see. I think it's gonna be tough to dethrone our 1 and 2 though. These are looking like the established 1 and 2. It'd be interesting to see if we get anything different. But at number 2, you probably guessed it, we have Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy, 22 top 16s, 96 entries for a 22.92% conversion rate. The highest conversion rate among decks with like more than 30 entries by a decent amount. This is Kinnan. It's here. It was a little bit like at the beginning of last year, kind of closer to that 5-ish range, I think, 5 to 6. And then we just saw like an explosion of this deck as especially like when the One Ring came out, it was very big for this. This is one of the best One Ring decks. It gets to really take advantage. You're already Seedborn using. Putting in like Manamo is just free for this deck. So cards that break the One Ring that I've seen higher color lists run, but it's a little bit iffier there. This has just become like, and I swear every single person I saw like tweet, like I'm thinking about getting into cEDH, they all picked up Kinnan. Like I'm surprised this isn't number 1 in terms of actual play. I guess if you weren't looking at tournaments, it probably is the most played cEDH deck at this point, just not quite in tournaments yet. There's not much to say. No new cards really came out since the last time we talked about the list. It just continues to be like a powerhouse that can go Staxy. We saw like, I think more, it's closer to like this last quarter where Trinisphere started to become more of a staple of the deck, sometimes over or with cards like Karn. It's just a super powerful deck that can kind of do anything. It's not just mana. It's not going to be a Winota situation where they remove your Kinnan and that's all. This is just a busted deck that is very popular and powerful, and at I would say like one of the easier ones to pick up and play at like if you're just kind of competent in general with Magic, picking up Kinnan and doing okay, I would say is like one of the safest bets to pick up, and I think that help the conversion rate.
Yeah, also has a super high ceiling as well. So if you take somebody like Max who plays it, and by the way, I think eventually Wounded Max is going to get that win. I really do.
He keeps getting that close.
It's super consistent, always grinding, always working on the deck. We had him on the podcast and everything. I just think that he's due for it, and that's going to be my bet. For going into 2024, that he's going to scoop up that win. That's going to be sweet and well earned, well deserved.
It isn't just him. No Kinnan actually got a win in this quarter. I think it's the only deck in the top 5 that didn't manage to snag one.
Yeah, and that's pretty interesting because like you would think like, and again, it's pretty arguable what happened in Chaos, the last Chaos event, that the results of that one, but we won't have to, rehash that. But that could have easily been like Max winning that event. So, but sweet list overall, super consistent. I know that it's got a great fan base that's worked really hard on just innovating on the list, keeping it clean too. Like you look at it at first, you're like, man, it's got a like Tidespell Tyrants, Thorn Mammoths, that type of stuff. But the play experience against Kinnan doesn't feel that way. It's kind of like Sisay. You don't feel like you're stuck with a bunch of planeswalkers in your hand. They're very disciplined how they mulligan. So they mulligan for like the appropriate situation based on the pod and seating position. And then the deck just kind of churns into what it's doing. So it's sweet. I like it.
Yeah, it's kind of like I had mentioned with like Kraum Tevesh, where like this deck, you have that like fail case of like, as long as I get a hand that can make mana, I will have plays. I don't need to necessarily have a payoff in my hand. I don't need Basalt Monolith or a way to find it. If I can generate mana, this deck will be able to at least have like a pretty high floor that it plays at. And then again, you're talking about like its ceiling can be crazy. This deck can turn 2 win. This deck can potentially turn 1 win. It's a little bit trickier, but if you just get some good stuff in your hand, you could potentially even just boom, turn 1 Void Winter. Good luck, chumps. Like you can, even if you're not winning, this deck has very high potential, and like the floor, the ceiling, it's like really good all around. The only thing it lacks is like that very concise commander agnostic win con.
Like a true A plus B that just can smooth it out. Again, like this is one of those decks too. Like if the metagame is like really mid rangey, right? And depending on people's removal and all that stuff, you don't want to get in a mid-range creature slugfest with this deck, right? Because it's going to just put some behemoths into play and it's going to beat you up. Like I've literally watched a Thorn Mammoth just dominate a game, right? Because that's what the game became about. It became about the battlefield. And again, another good Invasion of Ikoria deck. That card's really good. Like I wasn't high on it at first, but the more I played with it and actually was able to use the 8/8 in like different scenarios, it's a pretty solid card. Second worst Finale Devastation, still pretty good.
Yeah, you want to talk about like this and Kinnan, I think more specifically, but even Sisay, we talked about earlier with the viewer question of like the success of Stax or whatever. Good luck staxing these decks out. You're gonna get so bodied. Kinnan loves most Stax pieces. Just be like, sure, they don't get to do the turn 2 Tidespell Tyrant bouncing all their stuff. I mean that's tougher. They're just gonna cast their 6 drops, cast their 8 drops. What are you gonna do? You're a mono white deck that's developing fairly 1 card at a time. Kinnan doesn't care. They have a way better top end than you.
And they have a commander that just ignores your rule of effects. So
really tough to be a Stax player in a Kinnan world. Our number 1, I think people are gonna be really shocked to hear this. It's kind of insane, but coming out of nowhere from the top rope, we have Oswald Fiddlebender at number 1.
And all 4 builds as well.
All different builds. They're so different. You have to. If you had a database, you'd have to put them separately. They're just so unique. Here it is. No, of course we have Tymna and Kraum, 36 top 16, 137 entries, and the exciting part here, I think, the really notable stat: 26.28% conversion rate. We are not in the era anymore where Blue Farm just is like, oh, it's got big numbers and its conversion rate's mid. This has the highest conversion rate of any of the like 30, 40 plus decks, and by a lot, and with way more entries.
Yeah, and it picked up 3 wins.
Yeah,
like
there is like not a blemish on this record for Blue Farm here.
Triple win, second place, like, and plus too, when you look at some of the people that have picked up Blue Farm, you've got some really strong pilots like Freedom Waffle. Love Freedom Waffle, but yeah, Blue Farm just doing the Blue Farm thing. Is there any spice, Matt, to these Blue Farm decks that is like come about recently, or are we just still seeing the same old?
We did see Freedom cut Consult. That was the thing. We saw like some players had cut Imperial Seal. I think like Ori had cut Imperial Seal. Freedom Waffle cutting Demonic Consultation for like Born Upon a Wind. But like they got new cards. So like Dauntless Dismantler is a card you can probably expect to be in a decent portion of Blue Farm decks. They have so many 2-drops. They're not necessarily all going to run it, but don't be surprised if you see it. Not many of them have opted for Beseech the Mirror. It's pretty awkward in a 4-color mana base. I think it's become we're not seeing as many like tops without it, but we are seeing like a lot of discussion of like, I'm going to cut ad nauseam and then just run like the One Ring and or Talion. Because these decks just like not really nausing too much to begin with. You could argue whether that's good or bad. But yeah, and then there's just like kind of the usual suspects that come in and out. Like some of these decks are on like Professional Facebreaker. Some of them are on Dothy. Some of them aren't. You just have a lot of options with a core of, I would say, 90-ish cards that really stay. So nothing like, absolutely insane, I don't think, showing up. But there is like, I would say like at least like a 5 to 10-ish number of slots that are just like the next best card is questionable and you can just kind of slot them in. This deck is just, to me, if this was a tier list, I think you maybe could argue that this deck goes in its own tier.
Like S
Maybe,
tier?
yeah, like maybe Kinnan is in the tier with it. But pretty hard, especially without Kinnan getting a win. If I looked purely at these results and made a tier list, I'd probably have Blue Farm by itself. If I'm thinking as like as myself, I probably put it in the tier with maybe Kinnan. But based on these results, it would probably be like S plus Blue Farm, S Kinnan. A is probably Tivit, Sisay, maybe Najeela, Kenrith. It could be like you could even split that A plus and A, where like Atraxa and Kenrith are somewhere in there. Rockside, Kraum, Tevesh, and Talion are probably B, something like that. When we talked about this last time, I definitely think now you're looking for reasons to not play Blue Farm. When someone says like I want to play in a tournament and I want to do well, probably just hand them Tymna Kraum, and they kind of need a reason not to play it, I think. You could also hand them Kinnan, especially if they're newer. You hand them Kinnan, and it does play pretty differently. So there's something there. But if you were like, I want to win a tournament, there's not a metric you could look at, or I think even like ignoring the stats, like this deck list gets to do this so much better than Tymna Kraum that you could try to go this route. It's really hard to not just say like you should probably, if you're a cEDH player who really cares about results and that you're results oriented and that's what you care about, probably should play Tymna Kraum. I would like to see a shakeup. I don't think that's an inherently negative thing. That doesn't bother me. You were just talking about melee. I played melee the whole time. There were points where Fox was in his own tier and everybody's like, well, what do we do? It's like, well, you just keep playing the game. If you don't like Fox, you can play somebody else. You're not always going to play against the best Foxes in the world anyways, but sometimes that's just how the game is. But we've seen this year this not be the case. That's the reason I don't think it's doom and gloom, because there were points where Tymna Kraum had like a 14 or something percent conversion rate, and Najeela was almost at it was a higher conversion rate. It was almost as many entries. It looked like Tivit was going to take it over. So it hasn't been like, this has been the year of Blue Farm. It kind of became that way. And that's definitely the case right now. Going into 2024, I think that's the deck to beat. Not even a question. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. And again, I still maintain that Modern Horizons 3 is going to change the format.
I feel like Blue Farm is, kind of build your own adventure. It has probably, like you said, in the neighborhood of like, I'm going to just be a even broad, probably like 15 cards you can swap in and out, and that can kind of change how the play patterns of the deck are a little bit. When we did all these quarterly review updates, it's kind of became like a joke for us, like people who like, oh, Blue Farm can't win. And I'm just like, I don't understand that philosophy or that thought process, because it is what's winning. It's ignore your conversion rates and win percentages and all that stuff. What matters in the end is it winning tournaments. I don't care that the New York Giants football team was terrible the years they won the Super Bowl. They still got 2 Super Bowl wins in that short time span, and that's really all that matters in the end. Now granted, you want consistency and everything, but like I said, Blue Farm is the New England Patriots of the cEDH world. They're just it's there, it's always consistent, and it's probably going to give you more wins than not. So, I would take a hard look and without spoiling anything, I would say that Blue Farm definitely has the most wins of the year, right?
Just looking at the quarter before I go to the year stats, it has the most wins for the quarter with 3 over, other decks only got 2 and then some decks got 1. So yeah, so it had the not the highest conversion rate for wins, because that would be impossible at 137 entries.
It just wins everything.
Top 4s, it's not even close. Top 4s is our top 10 is like 4 2s, 2 3s, 2 4s, a 5, and then 14 top 4s. That is like S plus tier in terms of top 4s. And it had like its conversion rate in top 4s is very high. The only like in the top 10, Kraum Tevesh has a higher conversion rate, but it's like less than a fifth. It's like a sixth of the deck. So like for decks 30 plus. And yeah, let's look for the year.
Yeah, and while Matt's doing that, I'm just going to speak on like the fact that it is like pretty modal in how you design your creature packages, because like we talked about, it could have like all these different type of like asymmetrical Stax creatures. It could have more card advantage things like Archivist of Ogma, Professional Facebreaker, Fairy Mastermind. I mean, that's kind of wild, right? It just really depends on how you want to build the deck. I know Ian played a version not too long ago, last year. I guess, yeah, technically last year. It's weird to say that, but that like had, I think Talion, the One Ring, those type of things. And as much as people keep saying they want to cut ad nauseum, if you look at the list that all won,
They all do. That's
ran
why
that.
I never cut it. I always think about it, and I'm just like, well, the reason we have this is I very much think about what do the people who are succeeding do. If I'm going away from that, I should have a very good reason. There should be some basis that like, oh, this result didn't run Nas. There isn't any I can point to. They all run it. You know, whether it's the 80th best card in the deck or whatever, they're all running it. So we looked at our top 10. Let's go over now the top 10 for the year.
Yeah,
We'll do real quick top 16, top 4, and wins. For top 16s for the year, we had Kraum Tevesh at 10, Bruce Thrasios at 9. That's how you know these numbers are weird. Kenrith at 8, Atraxa at 7, Rogsai at 6, Sisay at 5, Tivit at 4, Najeela at 3, Kinnan at 1, and by far number 1, Blue Farm, 94 top 16s, almost 40 more than the second place, with the highest conversion rate of decks with more than like 200. No, there are higher conversion rates, but they're with much lower entry numbers, like even like less than a quarter. So easily number 1 in top 16s. And I would argue the highest conversion rate in terms of statistically relevant entry numbers. Looking at top 4s, our 10 is Dargo Thras, Tyam, Kenrith, Tevesh Kraum, Atraxa, Tivit, Sisay, Najeela, Kinnan, Tymna Kraum. Again, 39 top 4s compared to 17 from Kinnan, number 2. Much higher conversion rate. Conversion rate numbers are a little bit lower here, but like 3 to 4% more than the field, and with the highest number of entries by a lot. And then for wins, Rogsai at 10, Tyam, Atraxa, Sisay, Kinnan, Kenrith, Tivit, Tevesh Kraum, Najeela, Tymna Kraum, having double the number of Najeela and Tevesh Kraum at 5, with 10 wins for the year.
Yeah, and that's also going to not include some Star City events, because Blue Farm won that one. That didn't get added to the EDH top 16 because for whatever reason they do not use Command Tower software. And then the big massive event in Japan where it went undefeated, and that list was pretty sweet as well.
That was cool,
actually. Yeah, very cool list. Very cool list indeed. That's just some Blue Farm on the side right there. That's just 2 free big wins and bigger tournaments there.
And putting them at like 12 compared to 5. It is interesting. The numbers were pretty much what you'd expect for the year, other than wins, where it was kind of like there were some ones like Roxy only had 1. And then like Sisay and Kinnan didn't really win much, only getting 2 wins for the year. And then Kenrith with 3, Tivit with 4. And then Tevesh, Kraum, and Najeela with 5, like really standing above like the other decks. Like for the year, I'm probably putting Kinnan at 2, but it is struggling to win events. Whereas Tymna Kraum is the only deck that's like really bodying everything else with every stat that I think you could look at.
Yeah. So just, and what's funny is like, I don't even play Blue Farm. It's not even my style of deck. I'm a dockside go burr kind of guy. Here's what I wanted to point out. So the data, instead of having like 2 separate episodes of like a quarterly and a year, this is something I just wanted to point out. Well, we talked about earlier in the year when everybody was like, no, Dawn Waker style decks, they're top tier. And I'm like, yes, the previous data from 2022 was very good on them. And they're starting off strong, but as it started progressing, probably when we got into that kind of the tail end of the first quarterly review into the second one, we saw a trend, and the trend dropped. And then Rocco came out of nowhere, and Rocco started doing really well. And then Rocco took a dive, and then Rocco recently, they're like, for this last quarter, there were 3 Rocco decks in top 16. Yeah, and that's why we really talk about looking at data and trends over a fair period of time, because again, the quarterly reviews typically line up with set releases by and large. And again, it's a little bit off because some set releases are master sets or reprint sets or whatever. When we look at that and we look at like new sets come out, we see trends. That's why like we need to kind of see how Orcish Bowmaster plays out. Now it's just a card in the format. Like it's good. It can be ultra oppressive in some games. And some games, it never hits the battlefield. Like it's, I like to look at that, because if you went back and looked at like this data, for example, that Matt just pulled up, you'd be like, oh, wow, Bruce Thrasios still up there, top 10 deck. But I don't think it even sniffs the top 10 now, right? Like,
recent results are not pushing that at all. It's really just like that first quarter going into the second quarter, kind of like you said.
And just like this year, probably a lot of the decks that are doing well in from like January, February, March we'll see that. And then probably about midsummer when MH3 comes out, we'll start seeing a drop there and we'll see a different trend. And that's good to see trends. And that's not to say you can't play these decks. I think you should play whatever you want, honestly, like based on your goals as a Magic player, whether it's tournament or just with your friends. Like you should pick that. At the same time too, we try to give a realistic perspective that things can change, and it takes about a quarter for things to really change. People, cEDH used to be a lot slower in terms of the movement of the format, but now with copious amounts of set releases, supplementary sets as well, and then just more tournament scenes, the data kind of moves a little bit faster. People are playing way more in Discord. There's like a 40 plus player event every weekend, somewhere. So yeah, cEDH has grown quite a bit. So I would say it's more fluid now, and you don't have to be so pigeonholed on like a particular opinion or a deck identity or even how a deck's particular doing in one instance. Like who's to say that some really strong pilots pick up Dawnwaker, they go, oh yeah, got some new tools, let's retool it. And then it's doing really well again, just like how Najeela did, just like how Rogsai did, just like how Blue Farm shifted. It's like went from like kind of this weird like 4-color turbo deck to, 4-color humans list. Things can change. All it takes is some good innovation, some time, some effort, and the right people to play it.
So let me know down below, what did you think of this quarter? What did you think of 2023 cEDH? It was definitely the biggest year for cEDH ever, and I think it was awesome. I think this was amazing to see. I look forward to the data that we're going to get next year, maybe even being like doubled in terms of like the number of events and the size of events. I know we have a lot of cool stuff to look forward to. So let me know, what is your prediction for 2024? What deck are we going to be clamoring about at the end of the year? Or is it just going to be some new busted commander that gets printed that everybody's going to be running because they made 5-color Rogue Rack? Let me know, and let us know what you'd like for us to cover next. We have like a decent amount of topics we want to dive into, but we're always interested to see what you would like for us to talk about next, and we're always open for that. If you enjoyed this video, let us know down below what you liked. Consider commenting, consider subscribing. About to hit 6K. We got a lot coming for you over there. Consider supporting on Patreon. Get cool perks, get access to videos early, submit questions for the podcast, and buy the merch. I got one of the Don't Feed the Fish shirts and my hoodie for Christmas. They look sick. But yeah, Blue Farm is good. Rogsai has a higher conversion rate than Tivit. That's all that matters. With all that being said, go play cEDH, go top 16 in tournament with your favorite deck. Have a good one, everybody.